Is Lewis Hamilton bigger than Ferrari? Is Christian Horner buying a 20% £300 million stake in Alpine? Why has Antonelli been so underwhelming? And why don't they show the tyre temperatures and pressures on the live feed anymore? We answer all of these questions and more in this week's episode of Your Biggest F1 Questions. I'm Jason Hassett, this is Current and Combustion, and let's dive into it. Hello everybody and welcome to Your Biggest F1 Questions, the weekly Wednesday segment where I answer all of your biggest F1 questions. And of course, some of you send them in via comments, texts to me from friends and so on, as well as Twitter. And you'll find a link in the description to my Twitter, as well as the comment section, where you can obviously add your own questions for next week. And while you're down there, why not consider subscribing and liking, as it helps me to make some cold, hard YouTube cash. Just being honest. Let's jump into the first question this week from the dyno's mouth. Let's see what we got here. Aeroplay AF, one of our wonderful subscribers, asks, watching old F1 races, they said they've been watching for 5 years, watching old F1 races, they discuss temps and pressures, but not anymore. Why? And then also discusses that he thinks that the tires are filled with nitrogen, not air. So we'll jump into this. And Aeroplay, welcome to the F1 community. Obviously, you've been around for 5 years now, and I'm glad you're enjoying it. And I'm really glad you're getting into the technical stuff, because that's my favorite part of F1 as well. Actually, really, the drivers to me are secondary, apart from just winding people up as much as possible about them. Yeah, so to answer the first question, obviously tire temps and tire pressures still very, very important. And we still do hear the commentators and so on a good bit talk about tire temperatures, especially during qualifying, as they're trying to get the temps up to get into the right window to pull off a qualifying lap, as well as kind of cooling the tires, the cool down lap. So I think temperature wise, we do still hear a good bit about it, but I do agree that in terms of the actual broadcast, they don't focus on it like they used to. Like, we used to have the thermal cams on tires quite a bit, which I always found really interesting to see, kind of like you could properly see the window they were in, especially in races when they're following, or you'd have like dirty air and so on. I do agree they should bring that back. And I'm not really sure, if I'm honest, why they don't show the temps anymore. I would imagine, if I had to take a guess at it, it's that since Liberty Media took over, they're obviously trying to apply the sport to a much wider audience. And this is one of the reasons we got rid of the rainbow tires, where you used to have like ultra soft, super soft, soft, medium soft, and doner kebab tires. But they got rid of that and made it like soft, medium, hard, because it was just easier for, you know, the usual guest to understand. So obviously, like probably yourself, the more technically inclined fans like to know, is the softest C6 or a C5 or a C4, whereas a normal fan probably thinks, oh, he's on the soft tire, it's the softest, don't need to know more. So I would imagine, given Liberty's doing that, they probably are happy enough to just have the commentators kind of loosely discuss tire temps as opposed to getting deep into it. You know, and there's more engaging things like 1 centimeter from the wall and those kind of things. That would be my best guess as to why it's not brought up anymore. As for pressures, you're spot on there. The pressures aren't talked about anymore, or as much anymore. Realistically, that's because when it comes to tire pressures, the teams are always trying to get to the lowest pressure possible that they can, generally speaking, in order to give them performance and the most grip. Because obviously, the less pressure you have, the more surface area, at least is my understanding of it. I did study some physics, but I'm by no means a physics engineer. I'm a software engineer, so correct me if I'm wrong here. But my understanding is, obviously, you want to get the pressure low, just like when you're trying to get the pressure low in, say, off-road tires, as it gives you more grip as there's more surface area of the tire. So that would be my simplistic understanding of it. However, after Baku in 2021, they really got strict on the minimum tire pressures. Before that, there were kind of minimum tire pressures, but there was a little bit of variance and tolerance. And after the Baku tire blowouts in 2021, they got really strict on it. So I would imagine that the reason we don't hear about pressures anymore is because basically all of them are running the same pressure. Because you would imagine if it's 23 PSI minimum at a certain track, all of the teams are going to be running 23 PSI minimum unless they have a specific reason not to, because that's going to give them the most grip levels. So I think that's the reason, if I'm honest, is just that they don't really talk about pressures anymore as such, because well, there's very little variation. Now, if you're going way back, like when I started watching, it was 2004, started properly watching, I'd kind of seen it before that, and, you know, parents and so on watched it. But when I really got into it was 2004. And back then you had the Tyre wars, for example, you had Michelin and Bridgestone. And the teams were allowed to play around with the tires a lot more. There's also, you know, we've got tire blankets now. We've got strict temperatures that they have to be at and so on. So that going back to your temperature ranges as well, I guess back in the day, the teams would and the tire manufacturers would be working together to optimize pressure and temperatures and so on. So I think, yeah, it really just does come down to the fact that Liberty, first of all, we have the safety aspect with tire pressures, because obviously in 2021, the teams were taking the piss a little bit with the tire temperatures, and that caused the blowouts. So it's been very strict on the pressure since then. And as for the temperatures, I think, one, there's the tire blankets, and the regulations mean temperatures coming out of the blanket and so on are kind of similar. But two, I think it is just a simplification by Liberty, because I for one, would love to, like, I would absolutely love to see, given all the talk around McLaren's tire temperatures, I would love to see those thermal imaging on boards once again and so on. To be more prevalent, and like to see some graphic that shows like the tire temperature as they're coming through the corners. I'd love that. And I think a lot of us technical fans would. So I'm going to guess it's to do with simplification. I can't think of another reason why they wouldn't, because cost wise, it's not really an issue. They have the thermal imaging there, I believe, to spot regulation issues anyway. So just showing those on the screen wouldn't be a huge implication. So yeah, I'd imagine it's simplification. Thank you so much for subscribing and for throwing that question in. I really, really appreciate it. Hey guys, just a really quick interruption for those of you who only watch this channel for Formula One and you would prefer to just see the questions and answers or the topics that you're interested in and watch shorter 5 to 10 to 20 minute videos. Well, the good news is that I've created a brand new channel that you can check out called Current and Combustion Clips. The bad news is that none of you basically are subscribed to it yet, and that's what this interruption is to talk about. If you are interested, please do subscribe and you can leave it there. If you want the reasoning behind it, it's purely that I am also trying to start 2 new series on this channel for my own passion and interest that you've probably seen, which is story time about car brands and cars, and Car Heroes, which is about everything from drivers to engineers and so on. And both of those have run times of like an hour, plus this new format that I absolutely love doing, where I just answer all your questions, tends to be at least 30 minutes, if not 45. And it just makes more sense to have this channel kind of work towards people who are happy and enjoy watching longer videos. But I realize a lot of you who are subscribed aren't, and therefore I wanted to create a new place where you guys can go, where I drop every single day the questions and topics from this video in their own separate video. So you can just pick and choose what you want. It's exclusively Formula One, and you know, it's obviously free to subscribe. So if you are enjoying these videos, and if you only watch these F1 videos, that channel is probably for you. So please do check it out. And let's, with that, jump back to the video. Tom, next question. This is one that was going around on Twitter over the last week. Says, is Lewis Hamilton bigger than Ferrari? Short answer, no, but I will get into it. Now, this came about because of these. I've got a fan running because it's really hot here and the things are just flying everywhere. This comes about because there was some talk from Hamilton fans about how Hamilton was bigger than Ferrari once again. Obviously, Italy and Italian media and Italian fans, when it comes to Ferrari, are pretty hardcore. So this kicked off into a thing of like, no one's bigger than Ferrari. Then there was talk that Lewis is bigger than F1 and everything. And we discussed this briefly on the Blatantly Biased Racing podcast yesterday as well, which you'll find in a link in the description below. But here's my argument. So, there is one metric in which Lewis is bigger than Ferrari, and that is Instagram followers. Now, like, if that's your key metric, fine, fair enough, you know, then sure. But I don't think it's a kind of a valid metric in the case that personalities on Instagram are always bigger than brands, essentially, because it's a social network. It's meant for personal interactions. So I think that's always going to be the case. Well, look, fair enough. It's a metric you could use. I don't think it's a valid one for this particular argument. Now, What I will say is, if we're breaking this down, we have to break it into two things here. Because I think you could argue much heavier that Lewis is bigger than the Ferrari F1 team. Now, I don't think he is, but you could argue it, right? As for the actual Ferrari as a brand, he's just not by any metric. Now, I've heard some anecdotal talk about this in the comments of our podcast. People saying, oh, well, you know, my grandmother lives in very, very rural Kenya and she knows who Lewis Hamilton is. Or, you know, my brother doesn't watch F1 and he knows who Lewis Hamilton is. And that anecdotal evidence is great until you think to yourself, well, I'm sure they know who Ferrari is as well, which is what I asked back. Because from everyone from like 5-year-olds, like, you know, my kid and other kids know who Ferrari is. Vietnam veterans know who Ferrari is. They know what a Ferrari is. If you ask basically anyone on this planet what a Ferrari is, they will probably be able to tell you, oh, it's the racing car, the red car, the fast car, the expensive car, the one that my dictator had, depending on where you are in the world, right? Now, a lot of people will be able to tell you who Lewis Hamilton is, but it's certainly not ubiquitous. And I know this from traveling around myself. When I'm in the States, here in Mexico, you know, back in Ireland, in Europe, going to Thailand, different places around the world, I ask who Lewis Hamilton is or who Max Verstappen is. Say I'm in a bar talking to people and, you know, I'm checking out the sports results for Formula One if I'm not watching, whatever it may be, whatever way it comes up. I have had plenty of people who have heard of Ferrari, and even the Ferrari F1 team, who haven't heard of Lewis. I've never had someone who knows of Lewis but doesn't know who Ferrari is. Now, I will say I haven't actually gone on a fact-finding mission for that, but everybody knows what a Ferrari is. I think that's just a fact. And like, just ask anyone, do they know what a Ferrari is? Like, I don't think you'll know anyone who doesn't know what a Ferrari is. Simple fact. Whereas you definitely know lots of people who don't know who Lewis Hamilton is. Now, when it comes to the F1 team itself, I think you could say that's a closer comparison. My argument there, if I was to argue it, and by the way, this isn't a dig at Lewis either. This is just to argue the actual thing. I know sometimes I like to poke fun at Lewis, but Lewis has been massively impactful on the sport. He is a global superstar in his own right. And, you know, he's massively popular. I'm not trying to diminish that, but the argument itself is just, and I will say another thing as well, actually, he has really helped, and I know this irks a lot of people as well, and, you know, I'm not a big liberal or anything, but he has really helped to kind of open the sport up to more people and make it less of a white boys club, I think, or rich white boys club as it was back in the day and so on. So, like, I just want to point out, I'm not trying to criticize that. It's just the argument on its basis doesn't make sense. Now, as for Formula One, the F1 team, the argument there is, you could say, like, the Instagram followers. Sure, fair enough, right? But let's look at other metrics, because you could argue this on millions of metrics. First of all, an entire nation of Italy is behind that team. The entire nation of Britain, for example, or America isn't behind Hamilton. In fact, lots of British people are annoyed about, like, you know, they'll be Max fans or whatever. So when it comes to Italy, they all love Ferrari. It's a nationalistic thing, right? The Ferrari F1 team is Formula One in many ways. And it goes back generations. Same with Ferrari. You're talking like 4 generations of people have followed the Ferrari brand and the Ferrari F1 team. And the Ferrari F1 team was built purely as the core of Ferrari. And then the selling of cars was to pay for the F1 team. So I think it's pretty hard to like break them apart. You could do it in many ways. But then even on that, in terms of just revenue, you know, Ferrari, clearly the company hasn't beat 7 billion a year. And in terms of the team itself, it's hundreds of million a year in input and output. You know, it's worth a couple of billion. So it's worth way more than Hamilton's, probably worth way more than a couple of billion. You know, it's followed by people around the world. And realistically, at the end of the day, there's going to be a lot more people who are, you know, Ferrari fans, I would imagine. Maybe I'm wrong on this, than Max Verstappen or Lewis Hamilton fans or whatever, just because you'll have generational fans of Ferrari, you know, people who were Ferrari fans long before Lewis Hamilton. I guess the argument you could make for the team, and I will give you this, is if we take a snapshot in time, like, you know, you could say there were probably at one point in the 2014 to 2021, there were probably more Hamilton fans at some point throughout that than Ferrari fans. Maybe. I don't know. I don't date on that. So I would say, like, you know, does he have a bigger impact for a specific snapshot in time? Again, like, you can, if you really want to confine it, you can make those arguments. But long after Hamilton leaves the sport, and once he leaves the sport, it depends what he does after that. Does he make a Nike contract like Michael Jordan and really push himself out of it? Maybe that changes things. But if he doesn't, if it's just he leaves as an F1 superstar, then Ferrari will continue on for generations like it has for generations in the past, and there'll be new fans of a new giant superstar. So in that logic, generationally, it's just different. So I just can't think of any way in which Hamilton is bigger than Ferrari. Now, I know the arguments come up, and I talked about it yesterday, and I don't think it's accurate either. Some people have said, no, the only driver who's been bigger than Ferrari or F1 was Michael Schumacher. I do think that the argument for Schumacher is potentially, especially from the F1 team perspective, and you could make that one stronger, I think. I don't think he was. Can I just point that out? But the only reason I'd say that is nothing to do with Schumacher or Hamilton, in fact. It's just that when Schumacher was very popular, back in the early 2000s, when I was watching it, any advert, anything that had anything to do with Ferrari at that point, from 2000 to 2005, included Schumacher. There was also no social media, and we were all watching the same things. So I think it was much easier back then for, a Michael Jordan with Nike or a Schumacher with Ferrari to become this global sensation that was inextricably linked to the brand, right? Nowadays, it's so hard for that to happen because Lewis can be a huge sensation with millions and millions and millions of people. But because of how noisy media is, there will also likewise be millions and millions and millions of people who have no idea who he is. It's like people, I talk to people all the time who are like, because I listen to lots of different music, and then there'll be people who are like, how do you not know about this guy? Like, he has like 40 million followers on Instagram. It's like, I don't listen to him. In the past, that would be someone who's a huge sensation everywhere and everyone would know their name. But it's so noisy now, the world, that it's hard for anyone to do that. Whereas Ferrari spans across so much of that. Like, think of the amount of YouTubers, for example, who have Ferraris. You then have like people rebuilding them. He's on Jay Leno's Garage. That's just one thing. Then it's inextricably linked to every big TV show with rich people in it. There's Ferraris around. You talk about dictators and they have Ferraris in their garages. It's everywhere. It's across all of it. So it's a cultural icon. And I think Hamilton is that for a segment, but not in the way Ferrari is. And I do think part of this is like, I hear Max fans talking about like, oh, Max is bigger than F1 as well, which frankly is ridiculous too. I do think it is forgivable to think that though, because obviously you're very like the world, and we're seeing this especially in politics, and I'm not going to go off topic, but in politics, your worldview is very much shaped by the people around you, as it always has been. But because of social media algorithms now, it's so easy to believe that your view is the way the world is until you kind of go and like go outside to, like, I'm not saying you need to go outside and touch grass. I'm not giving that rant. I'm not that old guy. I'm just saying, like, I have had plenty of worldviews over the past few years. And then I've gone to, some random place in South America or a random place in North America or whatever, in Europe, wherever it may be, throughout the world. And it's like, oh shit, no one here believes that, and like, it makes you think about your view. So I think like that's a different topic, but the point is it does map to this. Like, if you're a Verstappen fan, you're going to get fed lots and lots of Verstappen information. So you're going to therefore be reinforced of all your views about Verstappen. But then they're not true outside of that group. So look, again, I don't want to diminish Lewis. He's had a huge impact on the sport. He was is an incredible racer. I think it's coming to the end of his career. His impact on the sport has been huge. He has given a lot of people in various communities hope as well. I love that he did that as well, and kind of opened up Formula One to a massive audience that it didn't have before. And bravo to that. But he's not bigger than Ferrari. He's just not by any metric other than Instagram followers, which, fair enough. You can have that win. It's one metric. Oh, I do point out as well, I know people will in the comments bring up the stock market hit. The stock market hit was also due to revenue soaring for the 3 months before that. And even if you want to say Lewis Hamilton, stock markets don't really prove that, because essentially, just to make the argument here, and please argue with me in the comments, this is what this is for, but stock markets and share prices are based on investor confidence. And if you have high revenue, high profits for the 3 months before, and your F1 team is turning around with Fred Vasseur has just come off the back with some like F1 team, which is central to Ferrari in a lot of ways. Has just come off the back of a kind of momentous upshift a little bit. And then your height, well, it was slightly, wasn't it? It wasn't crazy, but yeah, it was on its way up with Fred. And then Hamilton, joins as well. And they're spending a couple $100 million on it. That basically tells investors, look, we're in a good place. We're confident. We're going to make this big contract. We've got money. We're not worried about it. We're excited about our future. So the share price goes up. That's not just like that in itself is not correlating just in the same way an Instagram metric alone doesn't correlate the argument. You need to look at wider context. Enough of that rant. Amy, much easier one. Predictions for Spa. This one, let me think. So I talked about this roughly yesterday, but I think that if we're talking about like top four, let's say, of the cars on the grid, I'm going to say it'll probably be McLaren, Red Bull, Ferrari, and then Mercedes. Ferrari and Mercedes, I think, could interchange there because Ferrari have the upgrade. Depends on how that goes. Temperatures could help Mercedes. Those teams themselves don't need to seem to know where their cars are. So it's so hard for me to guess realistically where their cars are. So I'm going to assume that, Ferrari and Mercedes will be down there. Spa is a track that Max loves. The Red Bull is really good in high speed, straight lines, that kind of thing this year. Look at, Jeddah, Imola, and Suzuka. So it should be good around here. Especially if they can strip some rear wing off, depends on the rain, I guess. And then if there's rain, you would assume Max will be up there anyway. And whatever that car can do, Max will extract. So I think that car is going to be decent around here. Obviously, hard to extract, but it's going to be decent around here. So I would imagine that. Now, I would say that this is going to be one of those race weekends where I would assume the Red Bull should be close, but I don't know if McLaren are going to bring upgrades still, for example. I don't think so. I haven't heard anything. But I would assume it's going to be a battle there. The only thing that could upset it is if we don't have rain, or if we do have and Red Bull make a cock up with the strategy again, that could put, McLaren up front. But I would also assume, just by Formula One logic as well, that Max and Red Bull will have a really great weekend this weekend, because this is how things work. Essentially, Max Verstappen fans, clamoring to get rid of Horner. Horner's gone. Now they'll have a great weekend, and everyone will immediately be like, well, Horner was clearly the issue, not realizing things are a little bit more complex than that. So I would imagine it'll be a good one. So top three predictions. Lando doesn't go really well around here either. George does. I don't have huge confidence in Ferrari, even though I've just put them ahead of Mercedes. So I'm going to contradict myself here. But if I had to guess on top three, I'm going to say Max, Oscar, George. Is what I would guess for the top three. Let's see. Put yours in the predictions put your predictions in the comments below. And while you're down there, don't forget to subscribe. Hi, Jamie says, why has Antonelli been so underwhelming? This is an interesting one that I've heard, and I think even the race talked about this earlier this week when it comes to the rookies, in that, probably the most exciting rookie so far has actually been Hajar, for example, given his performances. And I will say, I don't actually think... So I do think Antonelli has been underwhelming, but I don't think it's a dig at Antonelli and himself. I think we have to look at the wider context here, because I actually think Antonelli has been doing a very, very good job. I think the problem is one of expectations, right? And also approach by Mercedes probably hasn't helped. So let me break it down. Expectations, first of all. The thing I would say about expectations is, I think Antonelli, much like Piastri, where Piastri was not a letdown in the first season, but probably underwhelmed the first season and second season as well. And we were all kind of unsure about where he would go, and look at him now. The expectations with Piastri and now with Antonelli, Piastri was like, oh, this could be the next Hamilton. Look at his junior career. And Antonelli was, touted by everyone, including, unfortunately, Toto Wolff and Mercedes themselves, as the next Verstappen. I think when you're lining up those expectations for a rookie, you're putting yourself in a place where it's always going to be disappointing, because we're thinking about it then in terms of like rookie season for Verstappen. Everyone seems to think it was 2016, or at least a ton of Verstappen fans seem to think it was 2016. Like, he won a race in his first season. Like, no, he didn't. His first season was 2015, and I'm pretty sure he was beaten by Sainz that year. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. I probably am, but I seem to recall he was beaten at least on points by Sainz. I'm sure someone will shout at me in the comments. It's a long time ago. Give me a break. But my point is, like, even Verstappen had to get to grasp with the car. It took him a while to get on top of Ricciardo, for example, a couple of years. Piastri, it took him a while. And then but even then, like, Verstappen in his second season was absolutely incredible. Piastri in his third season has been incredible. But we had this like expectation building that this kid's going to blow us away when he comes in. And it was just never going to happen, because there's just too much for rookies to get on top of now. From the tires, you're in a top team, so there's the pressure there. And unlike, say, Hamilton, when he came into McLaren, you haven't done thousands of hours in that car, thousands of laps, in that car, before you jump in. You've got minimal testing in old cars and simulators before you jump in, and you get a day and a half of testing in the car. It's not enough time to get on top of tire management, all these different things. So I think the expectations were way too high. So I think that's the first issue, and I think he was never going to meet that bar. On top of that, I do think there is a bit of a problem with, I think people genuinely underestimate just how good George Russell is, for wild reasons, and this includes Toto Wolff. I get why Verstappen fans want to underestimate him, because there's a brewing kind of behind-the-scenes rivalry there and so on, and people don't like to admit anyone's close to Verstappen, so I get that. But like, Toto seems to underestimate him. And, at the end of the day, like, I know Lewis struggled in the ground effect of Mercedes, but Lewis was still driving at a reasonably high level, and Russell was, over those 3 seasons together, Russell was comprehensively the better driver. You could talk about points, but like, there's tons of context there as well. So let's have a proper discussion here. But, so I think he's coming up against a guy who is probably having his best season of his career as well. Like, Russell has always been consistent, but this season he's been mind-blowingly consistent. So I think you're coming into that as well. So you've got a rookie coming in, having to learn all of this. The expectation is he's going to be the next Verstappen, and he's coming up against a Russell who is absolutely killing it. Now, on top of that, now with all of that backdrop, he's doing a pretty good job. He's got, roughly, I think it's 40%, 50% of the points of Russell, which is pretty damn good. And if you look at where Piastri was against Lando, where Lando was against Sainz, where, I believe where Verstappen was against Sainz, I could be wrong there. Don't quote me on that. I believe it was kind of, it was 50% or 6, maybe 60% for Verstappen. I need to go back and look this up. I'm making a fool of myself here. That's fine. Hit that like button if you think I'm an idiot. But yeah, my point is, he's doing a pretty good job. And when you take into account who his teammate is, how young he is, what he has, this is kind of what we should have expected. And I think it's not that he's underwhelming. It's just the expectations are too high. The other thing I think is that, and the proof of that in some ways is, Hadjar was very, very good in his junior career. He was just never that like outlier. This guy's incredible. And the expectations were low. No one thought he'd come in and go well, because, he was runner-up in Formula 2. He did a good job, but he was nothing stand out. And also he was quite, in his head a lot, shouting a lot and so on. And then he comes in and does a really good job, but our expectations are always also low. So it's a super job on top of that, not to diminish it, but you get my point. The expectations set it quite a bit. The other problem I think that Kimi has is one of management style. Not to say it's bad. It's just that I think Mercedes were very worried that he would come in, crash a lot and ruin his confidence. And they set him up to kind of start slow and ramp himself up. And I think they probably would have been better off to let him crash a couple of times than to do that, because it seems like he's taking it easy and trying to kind of get on top of things all the time and building up. So I think it is that approach as well that hasn't helped him stand out. But I guess only Mercedes would know that in and out. Look, I think by season 2, he should be a lot better. But yeah, I think he's doing a fine job. Like, I think he's doing a really good job. It's just not stand out for those reasons. And I think it will be hard for him to stand out for those reasons. But yeah, compared to any rookie, he's been brilliant. And comparing him then to pre 2012, is it 2010, when the testing requirements were changed, I think is unfair as well. So comparing him to rookies kind of since 2012, 2013, he's doing a very good job. A very good job. So I don't know. I don't agree, underwhelming, I guess. Alexander asks, will Ferrari's rear suspension help? Yes, I think it will in a couple of areas. I will caveat this by saying if they've actually fixed the problems they're having with it, which is a big ask when the team banner at the front is Ferrari, who, they've been less successful than Hamilton over the past, is it 18 years, 17 years, something like that. Even if they're still technically bigger. Right. So like the key things I think they need to adjust with this is, one is the problem is I think they went too stiff and too low, and they didn't give themselves enough adjustment in the suspension, which is why they've had the plank issues. So when they get into an operating window that works, they can speed themselves up for qualifying, but then they have to kind of raise the height, so they lose all their performance. Kind of similar to how Red Bull was able to run very, very low with their car and very stiff, but kind of they had enough tolerance there. Ferrari's performance is all found, I think, really low, or at least Ferrari's performance has been found where it's like too low and too stiff, and therefore it rides the plank a lot. And that's meant that they haven't been able to unlock performance in a certain window because they can't adjust the suspension. So it seems like, from what I've heard, that it's going to give them more adjustment in the rear suspension, which should mean that they can kind of move things around a little bit and be a little bit more open track to track to setup changes, bit of a wider operating window, which should help both drivers in terms of extracting performance and being able to get the car into the performance window without having to kind of really lower it or higher it when it comes to the plank, is my understanding. Roughly. Of course, all this is reported. We don't know. So this is just my understanding from everything I've read and heard. So, so it should really help them there, because essentially they've been in a position where they don't have much adjustment in the suspension, and they're either too high to get performance or too low where they ride the plank. So this should give them more adjustability in the kind of middle ground of that and finding that performance window. So that's the key thing, because obviously if your performance is all on one side at a certain track, that's going to wear the plank down, and your only option is to save the plank and become slow, then you're screwed. You can't take performance out of that. And also, I think this is a good learning curve for them, because while there won't be as much ground effect next year and the cars will be slightly different, there will still be some of it in the suspension and stuff. That learning will all carry over. So I think it's a good idea for them to bring it in and get on top of that. The other thing I think it will do is, from what I've heard, much like McLaren and Alpine's front suspension being really, really numb, because of the stiffness and lack of setup, adjustments in the rear of the Ferrari, I've heard it's the same thing, where there's very little feel in the rear, and that makes the car very difficult to drive, because a driver, especially like Leclerc and Hamilton, who like a strong front end, they're relying on being able to kind of, hold on to the rear as you're throwing the car into those corners. And if they can't feel what the rear is doing, then it's really hard to adjust for that and make those kind of micro adjustments as they're going around. So that's why I think you're seeing a lot of like swings and spins in Australia and like random things that you don't kind of expect from two drivers of that caliber, regardless of what you may think of Hamilton or Leclerc in the wet, for example. They're high caliber drivers. So I would imagine that it should help in feel quite a bit, in a similar way to, Lando, for example, might have got a slightly kind of slower setup because it's not as stiff, but by being able to feel the front end more, he's a lot more confident in the car. And sometimes that confidence can help, because even if the car is capable of doing X lap time, if you're only confident able to go X plus 0.3, then, you're better off giving a little bit more confidence and giving up a tenth, but being able to get that 0.2 because of the confidence. So yeah, I think it seems like a pragmatic decision, and Fred's been quite good with these decisions, but I guess only time will really tell, and we'll see. But yeah, that's what I would imagine that they're hoping for is, stop the plank issue and give the drivers a little bit more feedback so they can control the rear. Cool. Oh, and this comes into it. So, Mark, this is kind of a follow-on one, says, why have F1 drivers been complaining about numb cars? This follows on from what I was just saying there, but just to kind of reiterate and explain a little bit. So, when a driver is obviously on the limit of a car, and this is going back to what I was saying last week about, the limit of a car being accessible is different from what the actual limit of a car is. So, when you're driving a car on the absolute limit, then a lot of it comes from instinct, especially in qualifying. You don't want to be thinking. You don't want to be kind of trying to figure out what the car is doing, because that's obviously going to slow you down at least by a tenth or two, if not more, depending on how extreme it is. So when you're driving a car, and think about yourself on the road as well, like you're not really thinking while you're driving. You're turning the car, and the car is kind of giving you certain feedback. And your brain just knows instinctively what to do with that. So you kind of out of absolute habit and instinct react to certain inputs on the steering wheel. You hit what way would I put this? You turn and you kind of feel the car giving a little bit of grip. You kind of instantly let off the accelerator and slow down without even thinking about it. And it's similar in Formula One. And a lot of that feel in road cars as well as in Formula One cars comes through the steering wheel, but from the suspension, right? So you might feel it in the car and the way the car's yawing and turning and moving, but a lot of it comes through the steering wheel as well, right? And it's from those like vibrations and feedback and movement of the car. And your brain's like a supercomputer just doing thousands and, if not millions of just calculations every second of minute physics. And when you're a honed racing driver, your brain over thousands and thousands of hours and laps knows exactly what to do with that input, right? So the suspension moving slightly and, at the back and rear, it doesn't have to be a lot, but enough that when you're turning, the way the suspension yaws and moves, and the way the kind of that feedback through it will also tell you a lot about the tire grip and so on, because if the suspension gives, it kind of means grip is giving up a little bit as well, and you can feel those kind of minute things coming back. Now, what the numbness is coming from is with these cars specifically, this generation of cars, where it's mostly 60 to 70%, maybe a little bit less, of the power comes from the ground of the car, the ground effect, the Venturi tunnels. You want the car to be as flat as possible, as often as possible, because that's where you're generating all of your downforce. So even when you're yawing through the corner, you don't want the car to kind of tilt and pivot. You want it to stay as flat as possible. And the easiest way to do that is to make really stiff suspension with kind of a kind of narrow angle out, so there's not much movement in that suspension, right? The placement of it is further back, and therefore a lot more of the pressure comes through the arms of the suspension, and it doesn't move, it doesn't pivot, and the dampers just make up for some of the suspension. So what happens then is you get an extremely stiff car that is high performance, it's much faster, but because you don't have a robot driving it who can be fed kind of system information and calculate it, you've got a driver driving it. What happens is then the car doesn't move at all. So you're coming through a high-speed corner, right? And the car's not moving at all. And then all of a sudden you get a twitch, right? Your grip has gone, but you haven't felt anything. You felt no lead up to that grip going. Where you're coming around a corner and like the car doesn't roll at all. So you don't know how much is left on that car in terms of the grip. So as soon as you're uncertain, your immediate human instinct is to back off, is to kind of not push it any further, because you're thinking, I think it should be going here, but it's not yet. So then you start thinking, because your instincts are going, I'm not feeling anything. I don't know where this is. And then, you'll either go slower or you'll have snaps and crashes and spins. And we're seeing this from a lot of drivers. And it's one thing that Franco Colapinto has been talking about. Now, some drivers are much better at dealing with this than others. We've heard this from, not from Max directly, but we've heard this from Sonoda. Sonoda saying car's really stiff. I don't get any feel from it. Colapinto talking about it, Sonoda obviously is a very good one because he's been driving for a long time. So him talking about it was interesting. Colapinto's talking about how he's just not getting any feeling from the car. So he just doesn't know where the limit is, what makes it hard for him to go fast. Obviously, Gasly's been in the car for a while. Gasly's driven for a while. Maybe he's better at adapting to it. And Lando Norris, who's been like, as much as people will dig at him, has been very good at adapting to difficult cars. And we know this from former teammates who've talked about how difficult the cars are, struggled with it as well, where Piastri was happy enough to just deal with it and extract the performance. So it's one of those things, I guess, of, each driver to his own and kind of what they're feeling for. And I guess as well, if you're a newer driver, maybe in F1, I know Colapinto doesn't help with this, but it may be easier with that feedback. But that's why, certain cars like the Mercedes, for example, has been tricky to drive, but, you get some feel for it according to the driver, so that's fine. The V-Carb in particular has been one that, drivers talked about. It gives them good feedback. These are the kind of things that are important. It's not as stiff, not as hinged. So even if it's not as quick, the driver can kind of extract a bit more because are happier to get closer to the limit on the car, basically. So I hope that explains what that numb feeling is for the F1 drivers. And I think this is the last one. Oh, and an interesting one. Jeff, Horner's £300 million Alpine buy rumor. Do you buy it? Well, thank you for the question, Jeff. So this, for anyone not watching, is the latest news that Horner apparently has been approached, or at least there are people at Alpine thinking about, and I think Bernie Eccleston commented on it as well, of a situation where Horner could buy 20% of the team to give him, a skin in the game, and then obviously, depending on how it goes, he could up that, buy it over time, and so on. And the rough amount there is roughly £300 million. Now, £300 million actually for 20% might sound like a lot to the common man, including myself as very much the common man. But in terms of valuations of Formula One teams, and given Alpine was a works team and so on, you could say is relatively low. However, given that it doesn't include access and, an engine backing program like Viry-Châtillon anymore, they're moving to Mercedes, so there'll be a full customer team next year, plus they're 10th in the standings. They've clearly got a lot of issues going on. They've been cycling through problems and drivers and so on so far. Plus the fact that you would likely think about it if you were getting Horner in, that's a massive boon that would up the price anyway. So you would have kind of maybe a discount for him because what he brings to the team could be worth a discounted price. I think does make the 300 million and therefore a 1.5 billion pound valuation quite well. In fact, 1.5 billion pounds I think is probably close to $2 billion anyway, right? Like 1.8, maybe 1.9. So actually it's not that far off, let's be honest here. So maybe that's where I'm mixing that up. But Horner, as for the rumors themselves, I do buy this because this is what I've been talking about. And I think that Horner has probably given the signal to Flavio and Bernie and people he trusts to kind of start, talking behind the scenes about what they would want here and what would work. And I think 20% will be a good starting point for Horner. Now, Horner is likely to get a £50 million roughly buyout from Milton Keynes or from Red Bull themselves. So he wouldn't have all the money. I think his net worth with that £50 million buyout would be somewhere in the region of 100 million. So he'd have to put double his entire net worth on the line to get that. But I don't think he would have to do that. I think there would be either easy ways he could finance it, because if he has 50, 60 million in the bank and he's buying an asset in an F1 team, which are valuable at the moment, he could get the financing. But I also think there would be people who would come in on like kind of a quote unquote consortium with him. So I think there's merit to that kind of figure. It'll be a weird setup though for Horner, because he would obviously have to come in at 20%, which would mean that Ryan Reynolds and his group have more skin in the game than Horner does, and that the Renault Alpine group would also have kind of a 50% still. So would it 20? I think 24 to 26% is held. No, 24% is held by Ryan Reynolds' group, whatever it's called, with all the athletes. So 76% is held by Renault. So they would still own 56%. Obviously, Horner doesn't have a great backing with Renault, but I do think they're trying to sell the Renault Alpine brand anyway, or the team, anyway. So I would not be surprised if this is Horner takes it over, and Horner, Flavio, and Ryan Reynolds' group basically come together, and then they've got 46%. They get another consortium that they trust in. They get the voting shares, all of those things. So I think it would be a good starting point, and certainly a better starting point than anywhere else he could go. Because, I don't think he wants to get involved with Cadillac, because he wouldn't get skin in the game. Maybe he would actually, but a big brand. Audi's another option. But it depends on whether Audi want to give a 33% stake, because I think if he's going to Audi, a big brand like that, given his research from Porsche, he'd probably want a Toto-esque deal. And then anywhere else, like, Williams is closed, Haas maybe, but he doesn't seem to want to sell, so I don't see that. Ferrari, there's no option. Mercedes, no option. Red Bull, obviously. McLaren, no option. So, yeah, I mean, I think Alpine makes the most sense for Horner, and I think that deal, I think there is some truth to it. But I don't think we'll find out for at least 6 months, because he's currently still working out his gardening leave and payout package from Red Bull. So I think we'll be a while yet before we find out. What we will find out, though, is that is the end of this week's Your Biggest F1 Questions. As always, thank you so much, guys, for watching. I really appreciate it. And please do subscribe. Please do like. It really helps to grow the channel. Thank you so much for watching. And I'll see you next week. For everyone, this is just a quick interruption to ask a huge favor. If you enjoy this video, please do check out our 2 other series, which kicked off a few weeks ago and will be running every single Sunday, swapping back and forth from now on, which are Storytime and Car Heroes. Storytime jumping into the history of both the machines, as in the cars, and the companies that build them, talking about Porsche, Lamborghini. We will be talking about the Tucker, the GM EV1, a variety of stories that we deep dive into every Sunday. Or Car Heroes, the other series where we dive into the people behind those cars, the drivers behind those cars. For example, in our last 2 episodes, we have talked about Christian Horner and Sebastian Vettel, deep diving into their entire careers. And if you're interested in those, please do check them out, as it will be a huge help to me to try and grow the audience for those and make this channel into something where I can really deep dive into more interesting topics and hopefully find a lot of you who enjoy automotive as well. So thank you for that. Let's jump back to the episode.